Hello and welcome back to Wine Wednesday here at French Grocery. I am Kevin Lintz, safely back in the United States after my epic trip to France. And I will try to, over the next few weeks, relay as much as I can remember from one of the greatest adventures of my life. And we're going to start in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. That's where I spent quite a bit of time while I was in France. And I think it's a great place to start because this actually was the very first Appellation sort of wine district that was formalized by a French governmental process back in the 1930s. It is also one of the most beautiful places that you can go to in France, and that's saying something because boy, this country is extraordinary. Every bit of countryside from the north to the south is amazing. But we had some good relationships here, and this is why we spent quite a good amount of time here. In addition, they also had a very good year, a safe vintage. It was a good place to be at harvest, as opposed to some other parts. We spent time in Burgundy, but Burgundy got really beat up this year with some late freezes in the spring, as well as some hail that came on in the summer. So there wasn't as much activity, there wasn't as much to really look at and engage and take a read on. But Châteauneuf-du-Pape, another very easy, extraordinary vintage, I think is what we're going to find out of the 2016s. And what I have here are four very different producers that all occupy some of the same properties. And that was one thing that was kind of eye-opening to me, is Châteauneuf-du-Pape is not the maps of who owns what domains do what where, they're not quite as developed or accessible to us here in the United States as parts of, like, say, Burgundy are, for example, or Bordeaux. So a lot of it was still a mystery to me. I knew I loved these wines, I loved these producers, and they were all very different. And I really learned firsthand about how they are. And this is a great sort of teaching tool about how from one place that looks so similar, feels so similar, a winemaker can still put their mark on the wine, and they can all still talk about terroir being the only denominator. And that's not exactly true, because each person really puts their soul and their vision into these wines. Let's start with Domaine Paul Attard, not necessarily because they're the most emblematic of the region, but maybe because they're the most different here. What struck me about Paul Attard is just how much new oak is used in these wines. When I arrived at the domain, harvest is happening. They're bringing grapes in and great big baskets. They're bringing them on flatbed trucks and tractors. And what's interesting is that they're basically picked whole cluster. They're harvested by hand, but they're going to a sorting table where they're literally being destemmed. Each grape is being meticulously pulled off of the stems, and it's going over the sorting table 4 or half dozen times, as long as it needs, until basically every stem, every leaf, every piece of debris that's not grape related is removed. Now, that's not necessarily a standard that you have to follow when making wine. As we'll see, other producers do things a little bit differently. But what you will not get is you won't get that much tannin from leaf and from stem, and you won't get that kind of green freshness to it. You will get really concentrated fruit, though, and it's much more labor intensive. So you may see that flow through on the price as well. But the main thing that's different about them is all the new oak that they use. Almost 100% new oak for pretty much the entire regime. This is simply Châteauneuf-du-Pape. They do have some special cuvées that might come from specific terroirs, or might come from certain aged vines. But regardless, they're using 100% new oak. You can taste that in these wines. They are some of the more aggressive in oak, and that sometimes is off-putting to some people, and it's really attractive to other people. These wines generally get very good scores for those reasons, because a lot of these wine raters and critics really love the taste of oak. But I will tell you this, having gotten to taste a lot of aged wine while I was in France, and a lot of wine from this producer that went back several years, it does quite a bit for the ageability of the wine, whereas some other ones might fade. It sort of fortifies it in a sense. But when that oak rounds out and mellows out, it's really a great pleasure. And they're wines that that resemble, as you kind of imagine a graph, whereas wines age, even Bordeaux, Burgundian, Southern Rhone wines, they do seem to meet in this place where they can all be very similar when they've had age and they've all had some good oak regime. Domaine Beaurenard, another fantastic producer. What I thought was so interesting about them is, as we looked at several of their vineyards, they had one particular plot that I didn't see anywhere else in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. We've got a great picture of this as well, where the stones in Châteauneuf-du-Pape are generally, they call them galets, and they're round. I mean, they can be this big. They look like giant ostrich eggs almost. They're smooth. They're basically glacial deposits and river deposits. They're right on the Rhone River, but they're enormous, and in some cases the layer of stones can go down 12 inches, 18 inches, 2 feet even, and more before you actually get to anything that resembles what you and I would recognize as soil. So you look at these vineyards, and you just can't imagine what possessed anyone to plant anything here. It looks like someone artificially moved these stones there, but no, it happened very naturally, and it's helped produce one of the most distinctive wines in the world. Now, Domaine Beaurenard, they have vineyards in these places, but they also had vineyards that had completely different stones, still enormous stones. They still look like a dump truck had just brought them into the vineyard, but these were white. They were quartz and marble. So you can imagine that's going to produce a different tasting minerality, a different style of wine as from their other production. So that sets them apart as well, but also I would still consider them a very modern producer, but they also, I would say, use a little bit less oak treatment than Paul Attard. Everything still sees oak, but they use a mixture of barrique, which is sort of the smallest barrel that you might use in winemaking. They use demi-mude, and that's sort of a medium size, and they use foudre as well, which are very, very, very large tanks, basically, but they're there for long-term aging and not necessarily for any fermentation. So the oak in these wines is more subdued than here, but it's still present. And they also do something that I saw at Paul Attard as well for some special cuvées. They'll do direct fermentation in small barrique barrels, and I hadn't seen that before. You can imagine that as you see some of these pictures of not only what barrel rooms in these places look like, but this process of fermenting directly in a small barrique barrel, this can take up a lot of space because you can't stack these; they're open top. So there's only small cuvées that they'll do like this, and then what they'll do is they'll rack it after fermentation, which means they'll basically filter out the wine. They'll remove the fermented solids, but they'll put the wine back in that same barrel. So not only are we getting specific terroir wine, but we're actually getting the same barrel from beginning to end, and that's a special thing too. Clos de Cailloux, one of the greatest sort of natural experiences I had in my entire time in France in several different wine regions was walking around this property. I was surprised by how wooded it was, how natural it felt. A really, really beautiful place, a peaceful place to be. We were at Clos de Cailloux the morning after a rain, and this rain is going on during harvest, and there wasn't any concern about it because it wasn't a lot of rain and it didn't come over a prolonged period, so no one had a sense of urgency. It just sort of cooled down what had been a pretty hot week, it made things very peaceful. The smells that came out of the soil and the surrounding forests were fantastic. And this might be one of the more, dare I say, like traditional and Châteauneuf-du-Pape producers. I've always loved them because they always have a very, once again, maybe lack for a better word, a feminine quality. There's a spiciness, a wonderful perfume to these wines. It's easier because of some of maybe the less intense oak treatment to really pick up some of the aromas, the aromatics, the wonderful flavors that you get from being basically in Provence, some of the most beautiful places in the world. So Clos de Cailloux this was a real treat, because for us it wasn't the process, but becoming much more familiar with the terroir and going out there, seeing the soil, being with the vines, being hands-on with the winemaker, hearing his vision. He's a pretty visionary guy as well. These wines are all extraordinary. This just might be like my temperament, my style, a little bit more than the others. I didn't visit anybody in official capacity from Vue Telegraph, but many of you that have been shopping here for years know I'm a big fan of this wine. I did go to La Crau, where I think all of these actually have vines in La Crau. This is basically a plateau, being another much more hilled wine regions in France. That was a big surprising thing about Château du Pape, is there's lots of hills all around, but some of the best places are actually pretty flat, and they're just covered in these stones. So this cuvée La Crau, that comes from a single place, and we went there and we saw these vines. And it is amazing, is that you can't tell when someone's vines start and another begin. For the most part, these top-notch producers are all doing things very similarly in the vineyards, and they are treating every vine with the utmost respect, but they all put their own touch on these wines, so that when you taste them, even from the same vintage, when you taste them out of barrel, I mean, everything is completely different. And I love that kind of diversity, because if you were exiled to live the rest of your life in Château du Pape, God help you, you would still have a truly diverse selection of wine to drink, and not just white, I mean, not just reds, but I had some great whites while I was there as well, from every one of these producers. I love their white wines, and this is sort of an unsung hero of that region. It's a minority of the production, but they can really make some mind-blowing white wines if you give them the chance, if you deal with really good producers. So if you're a subscriber to our newsletter, you'll be seeing something soon. I will write about my experience at Clos de Cailloux, and a little bit larger the experience in Château du Pape. But we also spent time in Burgundy, we spent time in the Languedoc, in the Minervois. We spent time in the northern Rhone. You may have seen some of the videos of me clinging to basically what it felt like a cliff, trying to not fall down the cliffs, the slopes in some places in Saint Joseph and Cornas are really dramatic. And then finally in Burgundy, where it's not been a great vintage, but I got to meet with some good winemakers there and hear their optimism, including meeting with some very young winemakers that are quite literally the future of what may be the most prestigious wine region in the world. And it's great to experience hands-on just how humble they are and how optimistic they are and how energized they are, and the whole generation of young winemakers are, to produce great wine. And realizing that the world is their audience and people are paying attention, and to get to be that audience and get to share with them what we experience here in the United States and get to see it firsthand. It was an honor. It was a great privilege to be there this time of year during harvest. So keep tuning in, and definitely come in and try some of these wines and do a comparative. If you follow us on Instagram, I'll be opening them up. Maybe over the next few weeks you'll get a little chance to come in and get something by the glass. A little fun thing I'm going to start doing, just to bring some of these higher end wines into your repertoire and your profile, and the things that you've gotten to try before you take a bottle home. So it's great to be back. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being patient. Thanks for all the great comments about all the social media stuff that we did while we were there. We'll see you around here at French Grocery again. I'm Kevin. Have a great week. Kevin, have a great week. Kevin, have a